One of my favorite movies is also probably the strangest film I've ever seen. The 1971 classic Harold and Maude. The movie focuses on Harold, a dashing young man in his 20s. He's a man in his prime who should by all means be seizing life by the horns. And yet, Harold is sullen and morose because it turns out that he is completely obsessed with death. He stages gruesome fake suicides to disgust his parents and his potential dates. He drives a hearse and he attends funerals as his favorite hobby. To put it shortly, Harold is a very strange person. And while attending a funeral, he meets a 79-year-old woman named Maude and is completely captivated by her. Maude is a quirky free spirit who steals cars, plays the banjo, and dances the night away. In contrast to the young Harold, who is completely obsessed with death, the elderly Maude is obsessed with life. I think Harold and Maude was such a special movie because it stood in such stark contrast to the way that many of us live our lives. Harold was obsessed with death, and Maude lived every moment keeping in mind her mortality. And yet, we live in a death-denying culture. Sure, we all know intellectually that we are going to die, but we try as hard as we can to ignore that fact. We imagine that we will enjoy an endless parade of tomorrows, rarely considering what it would mean to have 1 year, or 1 month, or 1 day left to live. We put up a silk screen across the truth to hide it and distort it, so we can conveniently go about our lives without thinking about death. It's understandable. I mean, who wants to be morbid? However, when we cower in fear from the truth of death, I believe that we can create profound dysfunction in our lives. Consider this. In 2011, Americans spent $10.5 billion on elective plastic surgery. Our culture tells us that 40 is the new 30 and 60 is the new 40. By rejuvenating our faces, we think that we can hold death at bay, hold on to our youth just a little bit longer. After all, if our faces don't show signs of death, then we can convince ourselves in this culture that treats youth as a commodity that we are immortal. Rarely do people consider that what they hide on their faces cannot be hidden on the inside. Our death-denying culture also comes out in the way that people treat the sick and the elderly. In contrast to other cultures that revere and respect their elders, people of advanced age in our country are often treated as a nuisance or completely forgotten. Retirement homes and hospital beds are often the loneliest places in the world, as many people lose touch with friends and family who don't want to go and visit them. It's not that they don't love them, but being around sickness and dying is profoundly uncomfortable. It's just easier to ignore these more depressing aspects of life. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our death-denying culture is the way that it deprives us of the perspective that we need to truly live to our greatest potential. When people don't live self-reflective lives, they respond more to fear and insecurity than they do to their dreams and their passions. When people forget that they only live once, they live timidly, paralyzed by fear of failure, of rejection, or of putting themselves out there. Because they ignore the truth of death, they don't realize just how many opportunities pass them by. However, on Yom Kippur, we transcend our death-denying culture as we find ourselves today at the intersection of life and death. After all, the Day of Atonement is a dress rehearsal for our death, and we are symbolically attending our own funerals today. Traditional Jews wear a kittel, the white robe that they are buried in. We deny ourselves life-sustaining food and water, detaching ourselves from our bodies and experiencing the nakedness of mortality. We seek forgiveness with a renewed urgency because we don't have any more time for pettiness, grudges, and anger. And we recite the Unatana Tokef prayer, acknowledging with dread that life and death are out of our control. The powers beyond us decide whether this year will be our last. You might ask, why do we go through the histrionics of pretending to be dead on Yom Kippur? The truth is that Yom Kippur is not so much about creating a giant rift from our normal lives. It is about bringing to our attention some of the disturbing aspects of the way that we live. This is incredibly hard to acknowledge, but as we go about living, we become deader and deader. Not so much physically, but emotionally and spiritually. As we grow up, we lose our childish wonder at the world. When we figure out how things work, we don't hold on to that wonderful joy of discovering new things. After all, it's hard to appreciate nature or the sunset when we've already seen it 50 times before. Our capacity to love gets dulled as well. We often take our friends and loved ones for granted, not because we don't love them, but because the excitement of being around them inevitably wanes. Perhaps most disturbing is the way that our empathy and compassion get dulled as we mature. When we lose our childish beliefs that we can change the world, we detach ourselves emotionally from the suffering that we see in front of us. We lose our capacity to feel outraged by poverty, homelessness, and gun violence, and come to accept these blights on our society as simply part of life. We play dead on Yom Kippur in acknowledgement that when our senses get dulled, our capacity at wonder and love diminishes, and our ability to empathize shrinks. We really do lose our capacity to live. When we are faced with the reality of our death, the times when we sank into living on autopilot become all the clearer. During my chaplaincy internship this summer, one patient in particular reminded me of this truth. Betsy was a 60-year-old woman suffering from terminal stage cancer. When I visited her in the hospital, the most prominent feature of our conversation was the regret that Betsy had in life. She said that she deeply loved her husband, but that their relationship was completely defined by their ambitions for material and professional success. Betsy spoke of the loneliness of nights spent alone while her husband was on business trips, of a neglected spiritual life, and of feelings of emptiness and regret over misplaced priorities. When people are faced with grave illness or the end of life, they never ever say that they wish that they had spent more time at the office. It's true. Playing dead on Yom Kippur reminds us that there are always ways that we could have lived more lovingly, more empathetically, more passionately. And yet the angst that comes from regrets over opportunities lost and life wasted is just one side of the coin of Yom Kippur. Rabbi Shefa Gold notes that in a sweet way, our death becomes our friend on Yom Kippur. The mirror we hold up to magnify and reflect the meaning of our lives and awaken our true power to love. The fact that we are going to die can either terrify us or it can teach us something incredibly meaningful about how to live. We can either be like Harold, obsessing about death and not really living, or we can be like Maud, who learned from her death how to rejoice in life. So as we fast and contemplate our mortality on this Yom Kippur, we have to ask ourselves what death can teach us about life. Rabbi Dr. Rachel Adler told me a story that I think gives us a model of how to live. She knew a man who got in a car accident and had to have surgery to mend a broken bone in his hand. The procedure was a success, but when he woke up, he found inside of his hand a squishy rubber ball. The medical staff told him that he had to periodically clench his fist around the ball and then open it up. And he would do this over the course of several weeks. Open, close, open, close. When he asked why he had to do this, the doctors told him that if he did not open and close his hand, then his fist would clench up and curl up forever. If we allow the muscles in our hand to clench up and atrophy, we lose our capacity to open them. I tell this story because I believe that the open hand symbolically maps onto the emotional state of our hearts. Father John Hester of Stanford Hospital told me of a man whose daughter had childhood cancer and was dying in the hospital. The man could not deal with the horrible, tragic reality that he was facing, and he started yelling and screaming at the nursing staff to the point of verbal abuse. It got so bad that the nurses had to call security and escort the man off the floor. When Father Hester met him again, he was sitting in the hospital chapel, his hands held up to his eyes, his fists clenched, and he was wailing, "Why? Why?" Father Hester walked up to the man, tenderly took his hands, and slowly unclenched the fists. The act of unclenching the fists and opening his hands had a profound effect on this man. He stopped crying, he let go of his anger, and he was able to walk back onto the floor and say all the loving things a father should say to his baby girl as he let her go. By opening his hands, this man was able to come to a place of acceptance, even in the face of a horrible, tragic death that no one should ever have to face. By not clenching his fists and fighting against something he had no control over, new possibilities opened up to him. Opening his hands enabled this man to open his heart and become the loving, supportive, and empathetic father that he had to be in that moment. Therefore, opening our hands is the key to living life the way that it is meant to be lived. The image of open hands is actually a common way that our tradition expresses the fullness of life. In the Ashrei, God is described as Poteach et yadecha umasbia lechol chai ratzon, the one who opens his hands and satisfies the desires of all life. The process of opening God's hands is the way that God shows compassion and provides sustenance to all life. The same can be said of us. By opening our hands, we symbolically offer each other generosity and open-heartedness. In Deuteronomy, the image of open hands has a moral dimension to it. God commands that if there be among you a needy man inside your gates, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand to your needy brother, but you shall surely open your hand to him. Opening our hands and our hearts is not just something we have to do to express our empathy and love to those close to us. It is also essential to the functioning of a just society. Every aspect of our lives is expanded and enhanced when we open our hands to each other. And there's also an intimate connection to be made between our hands and our hearts. If we don't open and close our hands around that squishy rubber ball, after all, then they clench up forever. The same is true of our hearts. If we don't force ourselves to open our hearts, then they grow hard and unmovable. But if we open our hearts, we will see the wonders and joys of the universe. If we open our hearts, we can allow ourselves to love and be truly known by another. If we open our hearts, we won't take our loved ones for granted. If we open our hearts, we will see the hungry and feel compassion for those who suffer in poverty. If we open our hearts, we won't become jaded with life and feel unfulfilled. And if we open our hearts, we won't let our lives slip through our fingers. On Yom Kippur, we often think that the task of the day is to seek forgiveness and repent for all the things that we've done wrong. This is certainly the case, but it's also not the whole picture. As I reflect on this Yom Kippur, I think about something that Harriet Beecher Stowe said. The bitterest tears shed over graves are for words left unsaid and deeds left undone. We can't afford to stop saying I love you to each other, and we can't procrastinate becoming the people that we want to be. As Hillel said in the Mishnah, do not say that when you have freed yourself from concern that you will study, because you might never free yourself. There are always 1,000 excuses we can make to put off self-improvement and doing the things that bring us meaning. It takes a person of real courage and conviction to jump into the waters of life in spite of everything. When I think about the things that death teaches us about how to live, I think about my math teacher from high school, Margot McAuliffe. Margot retired from teaching when she was in her mid-60s, but only 6 months after she retired, her husband suddenly died. Margot was devastated. All the plans that they had made to travel, to spend time together, and to visit family were dashed out in an instant. Now, after she had time to mourn, Margot realized that she still had a lot of life left to live, and she couldn't just sit around and do nothing in retirement without her husband. She remembered a dream that she had had many years ago, to teach children in Africa math. So on a whim, she boarded a plane and went to Kenya to fulfill her dream. When she got to Kenya, she discovered a tremendous need for an academy for girls. The girls in Kenya drop out of school really young because they are married off far too early. And yet, when Margot met these girls, they told her of dreams they had of becoming doctors and engineers and pilots. Margot realized that she had to keep these dreams alive and keep these girls in school. So she took the job of spearheading the project of building the school for girls, even though she had no experience in fundraising or in project managing. And yet when she got back to the United States and told her loved ones about her new project, their generosity overwhelmed her and she quickly raised tens of thousands of dollars. The school is now up and running to tremendous success, and Margot, now 77 years old, feels more fulfilled in her life than ever before. Out of the depths of a tragic death came the inspiration that Margot needed to truly jump into the waters of life. The one piece of advice that she gives people is this: if you feel something tugging at your heart, listen up. Don't wait. And when you listen up, be prepared that it might be a much longer path than you ever thought, and infinitely more rewarding. When we break our fast in a few hours and jump back into life, I hope that we will all take these words seriously. Open your hands, listen to your hearts, and embrace the magnificence